Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. The Last Dinosaur is where we discuss the latest in digitization within the maritime space. Today's guest is Piotr Cichocki, Managing Director, Europe for Secro. Secro is a US-based company founded in 2021 by industry veterans and technology experts with the vision to enable frictionless global trade. Their next-generation electronic bill of lading platform enables real-time and secure collaboration between parties involved, cross-border commodity trade and transportation. Piotr, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
This is going to be really great. I met Michele, who's the head of Secro about a year ago, and I heard him speak at a small event, and I was like, this is really interesting because it gets down to the base of our industry, which is the bill of lading. But before we talk about all that, how did you end up with these guys? Like, how did you end up working for these guys? Relatively new company, little interesting time to join in 2021, post-pandemic, still a little uncertainty. Talk a little bit about your background, how you got to where these guys are, because I am actually super excited about this because of the implications of your product.
You're absolutely right to be excited, and I am excited too. Myself, I am a graduate of Maritime Academy. Maritime industry is my life, my passion. I am connected with the ship management for, I counted before that podcast, 30 years. And in my 30 years working in different capacities for ship owners and ship managers, I went through passion of being in a commercial management, in a ship management, in port logistics, in commodity trading. And I always strived to do better and to develop that industry and to bring it to the top efficiency. With the 30 years behind the belt, you might say, okay, Peter, so you started at the time of the telexes. And the truth is, yes, I started at the time of the telexes. I went through the stage of the phones, of the fax, of the mobile phone, of the email, and then we got stuck in the shipping community and in a commodity trade. And I switched also to try to harmonize international documentation. I served for 10 years at BIMCO Documentary Committee, and we realized that bill of lading, the core of the international commodity trade, is still paper. And this is like a last bastion of the paper inefficiencies. And at a certain moment in my career, I recognized that this is something that I might be interested in. And quite by coincidence, a few of my friends, maritime lawyers and shipping guys, contacted me and approached me to be part of this new project that lasts only for 3 years, but it is a very, very interesting moment in the industry. I was talking the other day with one of the London bankers, and he quite openly admitted this is the first time ever in the history of his experience where the law and technology are quicker than the market. And it got me thinking, where are we? I come from this very conservative ship management environment where we are still using bill of lading templates from 1977 or from 1994,
Yeah.
or in certain time charter parties that go back to 1946.
Yeah.
And I found myself in a place where suddenly the guy looks at me and tells me, Peter, with what you have, you're quicker than I am in 21st century.
Right.
So this is quite a change, wouldn't you
Right.
say?
It is a massive change. And I guess it comes back to what the bill of lading is. And I remember I took a great class when I was like yourself. I started off with a classical here in the US maritime education at SUNY Maritime. And I had a professor, as a side story, is a little bit of a rock star in and of himself, Professor Jeff Weiss. He taught several classes at SUNY and then at the graduate school around charter parties, trade. And I remember the first class I took in like import export you talked about. the bill of lading, and the classical three things that bills of lading do, which is document of title to the goods, it's a receipt of goods, and it represents the agreed terms. This was this way in the early 90s when I took the class with Professor Weiss, and it is today. It has a fourth one that this is what I found out when I met some folks from Secro, is that it also acts as collateral, which gets into some of the interesting things for what you're doing. So it's such an interesting part of our business, but it hasn't changed. So talk about like your approach to changing that, because it's something that I think people recognize they want to, be more modern, but at the same time, you're up against, I think, a little bit of, if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? But it's not 100% right
Correct.
either. We could do better, right? It's not broken, it can work, but there are some broken aspects. So talk about kind of where you are and a little bit of how your approach is with looking around kind of some of those challenges.
You're absolutely right to point that digitalization is a challenge. And digitalization, for me, it's actually a journey where we do not want to boil the ocean.
Yeah.
We have to recognize that we
Yeah.
talk about very complex legal environment. We
Yeah.
talk about very well-established processes that actually work, because the industry and international maritime trade serves a global population.
Right.
So what are we talking about?
Right.
Well, we talk about solution that brings benefits to every party, but to a
Right.
different extent.
Right.
I'll start with a bit of looking back. Everybody says, "Well, it ain't broken, don't fix it." But the
Right.
truth be told, that for some participants of the trade, a paper brings not only enormous inefficiencies in management of the paper document itself, from the environmental point of view. We talk about potential for a fraud.
Mm.
And there were a lot of examples in that regard. From that, even from that perspective, incremental increase in efficiency, removing the paper and removing the fraud is already a good reason to digitize.
Right.
It will require a lot of education because of the level of adoption is very low, and we are getting there. Now,
Right.
going into what's new, because all these functions that you are referring to and processes are basically just mirroring current understanding and a current application of the bill of lading.
Right.
So what is new? What is additional in that regard? And indeed, digitalization of the electronic bill of lading brings us to the next frontier that we talk tokenization.
Oh, and that gets into the collateral behind
Correct.
the different things, whether
Correct.
it's whether it's a container ship and you have a box full of TVs, or a VLCC with 2 million barrels of crude oil, one grade, going into the US Gulf or Rotterdam, because right now it just sits in a safe.
Correct. So basically, we recognize that modern law and the changes to the law and a modern smart application of the technology allows us to regard and recognize legally electronic bill of lading and a document of title from a legal perspective as the digital security. And from that perspective, we go a bit further. Okay, digital security, and if the digital security is recognized by the law, it can be used as a collateral under the financing agreements.
Right.
We have to recognize that today in international trade, in many, many instances, financing commodity trade finance institutions or supply chain financiers regard maritime transport transactions as unsecured, for the simple reason they do not obtain possession of the document of title that the bill of lading is, because it is paper
There's
and
paper,
it travels and it
and it
takes and it
travel.
takes forever
It
to
take
actually get.
I have a great story. I just gotta just jump in here. I was a broker as we discussed before we got on, for many years. I had a great client. This particular company was coming out of bankruptcy, but it was a like kind of a secured bankruptcy. They were going to continue operations. It was just more of a financing thing. They got upside down in their debt, and but their operations and everything was fine. At first, chartering a ship on their behalf, people were a little nervous. I'm going to get paid. Now, what they don't understand, at least the way I understood it, they were Chapter 11, which the court said you have to keep producing everything. The court is actually securing it. You're going to get paid. It's everybody before that was in the bad spot, but anything from Chapter 11 on were in a secure spot. But so a lot of ship owners said, listen, well, we want to be conservative, so we want to get paid before we discharge. Okay. I had one particular owner, we agreed terms, but then they decided to change it where they said, we're not going to discharge against unless we get the original bills of lading. Now, the cargo was coming from Venezuela, and Venezuela has always had difficulty getting the bills of lading out. It was just their custom, right? They get to it when they get to it, they get it out. And then sometimes it wasn't always the most efficient way to get out. They had a lot of inefficiencies. This was in the early 2010s, so things were kind of really going downhill. And what happened is the ship owner said, I'm not discharging this parcel. My charterer said, well, I'm going to go dry. I can't I have to shut my refinery then. And I basically volunteered to fly. We tracked it. The BL was someplace in a FedEx warehouse outside of Nashville. I said, I'll fly down to Nashville. I'll get it, put it in the car, and drive to Houston. And the chartering person, she's like, yeah, don't. We'll get some. They had a swap with somebody, and they were able to continue the operations. But the point is, it's only a 6-day trip. It's closer to Mexico. Mexico is only a 2-day trip, so you have to cut the BLs, get them on a plane, get them to the discharge port. In this case, it was coming from Venezuela. It was still a week after discharge, and they weren't anywhere to be found. And it could have caused, a major problem. But they were basically on a truck, and then a plane, and then another truck, and then somebody. It's crazy. Exactly. It's crazy to think about what they represent just being tossed around some warehouse in Nashville.
You're absolutely right. I mentioned about benefits for basically every entity, and you are right to point that when we talk about using digital tools during the drafting or issuing the bill of lading, it's just using different tool. But when we talk about electronic bill of lading from the perspective of the carrier being an owner, it brings an enormous promise of instantaneous availability of original of the bill of lading.
The bill, yeah.
To be presented at discharge.
Right.
To avoid letters of indemnity.
Yes, that's the other piece, because what happened on that particular charter party is we agreed it. We had it we negotiated it, which is usually, if you negotiate terms, takes precedent over terms that are kind of buried in there. And I went ahead, and what I did is we negotiated, and they basically said, it was a very conservative owner, said, our board has spoken. We will not be discharging against this until we get the original BLs. Yep. And, that hurt them in the long run, because that charter wouldn't do business with them for 2 years. Nope.
Imagine additional benefit. So when we think about instantaneous availability of the original and avoidance of the LOI, that's one advantage of electronic bill of lading.
Right.
But another advantage specifically for the carrier is ability to know, where today the owners don't, who the current holder of the bill of lading is, who the current consignee of the bill of lading is, what was its journey, so to speak, between the holders, between the entities in the chain.
Right.
Today, the owners are left in the dark.
Right.
They don't know to whom the bill of lading that they issued has been endorsed to. They don't know where it is. Electronic bill of lading, specifically for the party of the owners, brings a new reality.
Right.
It is a bill of lading issued by the given owner. And considering a current patchwork of legislations, especially when we talk about sanctions, about due diligence, about security, about risk assessment, it is absolutely crucial for the parties that participate, that are contractual parties to the bill of lading, to actually know who is in possession of my bill of lading and whether actually the endorsement or the consignee is the party that I will be able to deal with or not.
Right.
That's another perspective where electronic bill of lading brings a benefit to the owners. And I wanted to circle back to the concept of the digital security.
Right.
Bill of lading, especially as a paper, is being used as a security, especially under transactions financed through letter of credit. The paper bill of lading is accepted as a security.
Because it offsets it's basically the collateral. So if you have a letter of credit
Correct.
for X, you
Yes.
say, well,
Yeah.
I have a million barrels of West African crude oil valued at.
The difference, however, is that when that paper is accepted as a security, it does not mean that it is actually booked by the bank as a security on its accounts.
Okay.
There is a lot of trust in that area, and the fact that the bank accepts a security does not mean that the bank actually offers that borrower interest rate on the money that they are lending for the secured transaction.
Okay.
In many instances, the fact that the paper bill of lading is accepted does not mean a beneficial financing terms.
Mm,
Now, the electronic bill of lading, with its instantaneous availability and a legal recognition, has a potential to change that, and quite drastically.
right. Because then you could borrow, it becomes almost, I don't want to say an investment vehicle, but there is a component to it where there is some not only collateral, but then potentially interest or so on.
Correct. The current assumption and the current understanding of tokenization, talking about technology, but coming back to the legal perspective, is that there are jurisdictions that already recognize digital security.
Right.
And there is a very strong interest from commodity trade finance institutions, so banks, but also supply chain financiers, to accept bill of lading, electronic bill of lading, as a digital security that can be possessed, that can be legally recognized, that can be booked. And against such a security, there is an opportunity not only there's an opportunity to offer a cheaper cost of money.
Right. And it also opens in the long term, if it becomes more commonplace, almost a marketplace for this sort of potential, right? You could trade, it's almost another way of trading paper. But I want to go back a little bit when you talk about tokenization. So you are talking about the product using blockchain, right? Which is very interesting, right? Can you expand on that a little bit? Not from a technical point of view, but the blockchain, it's been talked about a lot and it got quiet. And now here we are talking about it again. But I think, I think everybody, it was a shiny object for a long time. Blockchain's going to solve all the problems. When I realized
Yes.
that there was too much maybe focus on the technology and not what we talked about earlier, which was what problem you're solving. And you talk about the several
Yeah.
different layers. From a technology point of view, that's what you're using. I'd like to ask, how are people receiving that in terms of not only what you're trying to do, but the technology that you're using it when you go in and talk to big companies or small company, any companies?
We have to recognize that concept of blockchain evolves. And obviously everybody in the early in the early years of dealing with the blockchain, everybody associated blockchain with the digital currency. However, current application of the blockchain technology goes very, very much beyond that. Meaning that there are there are technologies using blockchain or distributed ledger that are currency-less, which means that you don't mint any digital coins. that the sole purpose of the given blockchain is actually to provide ability to use a distributed ledger to create tokens.
Right.
Now, those tokens are not connected to any digital currency, but those tokens allow a very, very secure creation of a single digital token, non-fungible token that can be possessed by a single entity or a single person, which means that current understanding and current application of that technology allows us finally to create an agnostic concept of a token that can represent anything. In our case, we use that technology and the concept of token to create electronic bill of lading. And as such, what is other difference apart from the smart application of technology? Law. Change in the law.
Right.
In the past, it was impossible to recognize electronic documents of title or any negotiable instruments. They had to be in a physical form.
Right.
Today, law allows for that.
Right.
Which means that we are able today to use that technology of tokenization to create electronic bill of lading as a token, to create insurance policy, assignable insurance policy as a token, to create a assignable warehouse receipt as a token, to create electronic payment undertaking as a token. And then it's very, very easy, but also very, very secure to be able to transfer possession and control over such a token to another entity.
What I keep coming back to is you refer to the law and how things are changing, because there's been some very positive things. I think, was it the UK about a year ago? I think it was in September.
Correct.
They were the first ones. I mean, they put the legislation forward years before, but it was enacted, I think, around September 30th or October 1st, somewhere in that ballpark. There
Correct.
was they had that, and then more recently, I read about somewhere else. I'm slipping. Was it Singapore's? Maybe it was another European country who is also
France.
starting. That's what it was. Who's also starting to recognize. So it seems like, the not only is the idea behind electronic bill of lading a good one, it seems like, you kind of have, I guess, for a lack of a better term, the marketplace and the legal framework is helping as well.
Absolutely right. United Nations, and specifically UNCFACT, back in 2016, adopted so-called model law on electronic transferable records. It's like a template of the law
Right.
intended for any country in the world to adopt it, and in such a ways allow for the harmonized legal environment governing electronic transferable records, so like including the bill of lading. And it was 2016, and many countries started to look at this. And obviously there was an Abu Dhabi and there was a Kuwait, but considering major international commodity trade countries, the first one that actually looked at it really was Singapore.
That
And
makes
Singapore
sense.
adopted that law in 2021. And you might be asking, oh, that's a very coincidental with the moment when Secro was established.
Yeah, right.
Because obviously the people that were very much vested, including myself, we were looking at these changes in the law,
Right.
and we used that new law to actually build our solution.
Right.
In 2020, when United Kingdom took over leadership of a G7, and in 2021, G7 countries recognized, despite pandemics, that this law has to be adopted to drive forward globalization and digitalization and harmonization of the law.
Right.
It took UK 2 years to actually go through the proper legislation process, but indeed in September 2023, UK adopted a law allowing us finally to use it globally. Now, you might ask, Peter, but you talk only about Singapore and UK. How come you claim that it can be global? Now, the truth is that in international commodity trade, there is something called freedom of choice of law.
Right.
And we have to practically recognize that when we talk about sale and purchase contracts or even international commodity financing agreements, a very substantial part of those agreements are governed by the choice of law, which is UK.
Which is right.
And
And you
it's
see that in every charter party where the charter parties
correct.
govern US law, US law New York, US law Houston, even then it's US law, or UK law, so on and so forth. And you see that. So that
Correct.
basically the connection and the drive for getting it applied doesn't lie in the jurisdiction of the trade. Even it could be we're going to take UK law, but it's a cargo going from from let's say China to Australia. It's a cargo, and
Correct.
the ship owner is South American base, and the broker sits in North Africa. I mean, it could be all sorts of, with never touching it, but the only real connection is no, in the charter party we're going to use UK law, Singapore law.
Yes, that is an assumption when it comes to application of digital tools in the international commodity trade. And there are many countries that at the moment pursue adoption of the similar law. France adopted it basically just a few weeks ago. Germany is looking at it. United States, a decision is obviously pending the oncoming election. But there is a very strong drive on both sides to support that kind of a law at the both federal and the state level. China is very aggressively pursuing finding a general solution to the digitalization. So you might say that overall, while there are only a few formal jurisdictions that adopted the law that allows us to do what we do, the interest over there is overwhelming. It is actually happening in front of our eyes.
It's interesting because it is going to change things, and then will that bleed into charter parties, letter of credit, all the different associated contracts will have a more, a lot of them are electronic per se, but do some of these other contracts become more tokenized over time as well? I think becomes an interesting discussion point.
You're absolutely right. The different countries all over the world are at a different phase of their digitalization, starting with adoption of digital signature, going through allowance for or recognition of electronic documents like I don't know, commercial invoice. But ultimately, and globally, we already know where we go. We
Right.
aim at digitalization of documents of title. We aim at ability to tokenize responsibly those documents or those assets ultimately that can and should be tokenized.
I mean, we could probably talk about this whole thing because it is super fascinating, and it is kind of the backbone of all of the other things that we do, whether it's trade emissions or the bill of lading is really, and the associated principles that go along with it are really the backbone of it. And I started at the beginning saying I learned about this 30, 35 years ago. You've been in the business for a similar amount of time, although, and I'm going to try some video. We maybe look a lot younger. So, that's okay as well. As you start talking to people, and whether you have university age children or you get interns, and they start to look at different things like, oh, I can go work for Meta, I could work for Tesla, I could work for SpaceX, NVIDIA, all these really cool companies, and you have an intern or maybe somebody has these choices. Why should they come and work in the maritime space, whether it's what we're doing, what you're talking about here, seafaring, maybe a little more connected, port operations. What you have a varied enough background with the similar background as me. Why would you tell somebody to pursue a career in our business today?
Well, first of all, this is one of those last frontiers of where we are actually bringing digital tools to the industry, to the international community that is deeply ingrained in in a paper.
Right.
Anyone that is interested in change management,
Mm,
anyone that is interested in international community,
yeah.
anyone that can understand incredible benefits that this digitalization bring, not only to existing people, but also to the smaller entities. We forgot about one thing, that from the global perspective, that digitalization not only fits into the global sustainable goals by removing paper, uh,
Yep.
by by
Yep.
facilitating
Yep.
international trade, but also we have to recognize that digitization with the promise of tokenization of the bill of lading and treating the bill of lading as the digital security opens door to new financing for those international traders, originators, buyers, shippers, manufacturers who currently are denied the access to the funding because of the lack of transparency, lack of visibility, lack of reliability of the tools that they use. If I describe this to my sons, they say, Dad, so you are actually facilitating international trade and a globalization, right?
Right.
Yes. And in the meantime, you also lower the cost of money, right?
Yep.
Yes. And you lower the use of paper, right?
Yep.
Yes. And in the morning, you were talking to the owner in Singapore, and in the afternoon, you were talking to the miner in Chile, and in the meantime, you talked to some guy from South Africa, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
travel all over the world to educate these people around it, right? Yes, I
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Is we are at a crossroads where uh, there are a lot of products and projects that are really trying, and some of those will succeed to make a material impact, not only to maritime shipping, but it'll be to global trade because it really we're just a subset of global trade. So that's kind of interesting as well. And that's what I tell people. I said it's one of the most interesting jobs in the world. Speaking of travel, as we like to wrap up, but again, we could probably, I have a feeling I'd like to do a follow up in a year or two with you because I think it's so, this is like such a deep topic. We could keep going. But as we wrap up, and I love to ask this question, and you travel a lot, what's in your briefcase or what's in your Kindle, or if you have one of those electronic books, talk about electronic books, what are you reading? Are you writing something? And I've had people like say, I don't read, I don't like to read, I listen to audiobooks, I listen to just
Oh no.
your podcast because it's so wonderful, all these things.
Well, um, by birth, I am Polish. Uh, by point of view, I'm global.
Right.
But at the moment, I live in Europe, and uh, and I live in Poland. And I am very much concerned with what's going on geopolitically in that part of the world. And there is a famous British historian by the name Norman Davis. Norman Davis dedicated his life to write history books about that part of Poland, that part of the world that I live in, about Poland. And the books that he's writing about, whether Poland or Central Europe, are a great reference for any person that would like to better understand what's going on here. To be honest, a concern over the current developments led me back to those books, and that is what I'm reading to better understand or to maybe reread just what I know when it comes to the war in Ukraine,
Mm,
to what happens in Belarus, to what
yeah.
happens to the Baltic countries in Balkan Peninsula. This is a point of concern. So
So on a lighter note, I have read, because it is a good thing, but on a lighter note, I have read a very interesting series of books. one of which is called The Polish Officer by
Hmm.
Alan Furst, Furst. He writes a series of historical novels based around World War II.
Hmm.
And what's fascinating is so we know a very American Anglo-centric history of World War II. And I'm not saying it was whitewashed or anything else like that, but it's a very specific D-Day, this thing. It's a very specific. And this author does is he takes like a character and it's a person. It's not a famous person. They maybe touch it, and they'll deal with like the French Resistance or the Polish Resistance, or there was one of the books which ended up on a tugboat in Hungary, like trying like, and there was the Nazis on one side, the communists on another. Didn't know anything about it. And obviously it was fictitious trying to get out, but the battles were real. Everything was real. The timing was real. The presence of the Gestapo was real. And the first one I read was The Polish Officer. And it's a whole series of books. And what is fascinating is so there's, you know, person A is the main character with person B, C, D, and E being lesser, and then a whole cast of
Hmm.
whatever. And then the next book, person A is in the whatevers. Person C is the main character, and then person R is and then he shuffles the deck, and it's somebody else, right? Who you met
Oh,
on one or
nice.
what's cool is, and there's probably about 15 or 20. So you meet this character, woman, man, for like 2 pages. Gets, one guy got shipped off to, Siberia, gone. And then like 2 books later, they show up. It's it is
It's a very
it,
nice concept.
it's
What's
a
his name? Alan
Alan
first?
First, Furst, easy reads. So like I know it's summertime, and if you go to the beach or to the mountains wherever you are in Poland, easy reads. I don't think necessarily you have to read them in order. There is an order, but like I've kind of bounced around. Like I said, it's just, but it makes you think about the geopolitical politics of things that, again, we looked at it from, okay, Normandy, like, I knew about what, Africa. Then, if you've seen the movie Patton, you kind of know it was North Africa and then into Sicily, then into Italy and so on. And it, being my age, my dad made me watch Patton, made me watch the movie with Clint Eastwood. Uh, I can't think of it.
Eagle's Nest.
No, no, no. Kelly's Heroes. You want to talk about the
Oh,
other
okay.
one? Kelly's
Oh,
Heroes,
okay.
where they steal the gold from the Nazis. I mean, that's a very American centric. The longest day, these other things, but you kind of have that, all this other stuff that was happening in Russia, that was happening in Eastern Europe. You kind of, and yes, about the concentration camps and things like that, but all the stuff around it, it's just, I'm like, wow. And it still has in ways implications today. So it's
Unfortunately, it does. But I mentioned about children and about bringing them to this specific job. I usually tell them, look, if you close yourself in any given area, and you do not recognize that we are in a global community
yeah,
and that you do not support that globalization, um, you will then suffer.
it,
So just
it,
recognize where your shoes have been made, where
oh
your
yeah,
shirt, where everything is done, and then work on maintenance of this because that's important.
absolutely, yeah. It's really interesting because, um, I think it was highlighted very briefly during COVID. Like I say briefly in the history of time, yeah, everybody was worried about where they got that toilet paper and can I get a new car and all this other stuff. And then it died down. And then it was highlighted again with the Ever Given. But the good thing about the supply, the way that we work our supply chains is that even with the Ever Given, once it was kind of figured out, they were able to kind of sort those out. And then this other part is once they were able to, then even with the Houthi attacks, you're routing things around. Yeah, the 10 ships that got jammed up there, sure, or got first routed around. That's the issue. But now supply chains are resilient enough that like, no, we've built it in, and yeah, there's delays now, but not later. So I think you're right. It goes back to understanding we're all kind of connected for sure. So, Piotr, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I appreciate you teaching us about what you do in a Secro.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of The Last Dinosaur, Maritime Shipping in the Digital Age, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. As a reminder, if you enjoy this episode, please follow the podcast and leave a 5-star review. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and improve our content. Don't forget to share the podcast with friends and colleagues who are passionate about the maritime industry. Every share helps us grow our community. If you'd like to support the podcast, consider buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/thelastdinosaur. Your support helps cover the cost of production and keeps the show going strong. Lastly, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode or becoming a partner, please reach out to me directly. Drop me an email at thelastdinosaurpod@gmail.com. I'm always looking for partners who share my vision for the future of maritime shipping in the digital age. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time on The Last Dinosaur.